Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The child arrived on a night when stars forgot their shyness and tumbled across Bellwether's gentle sky like scattered coins from heaven's pocket. Soul breathed their first breath as meteors painted silver stories above the hospital windows, and the nurses whispered that the delivery room felt warmer than rooms usually dare to be, as if the universe had leaned close to witness something tender beginning. On Soul's left wrist, pale as morning mist, a crescent birthmark rested like a whispered secret, delicate, luminous, pulsing faintly with light that had no earthly source. Soul's mother, Elena, hummed lullabies she couldn't remember learning while cradling her newborn, her voice threading through the meteor-blessed darkness like smoke from a hearth that had always been lit. Their father, David, stood at the window counting falling stars, his heart full of the particular joy that comes when the world offers exactly the magic a moment needs. Neither parent questioned the crescent's gentle glow, accepting it the way they accepted Soul's perfect fingers and the way their cry harmonized with the night wind's song. The house on Maple Street welcomed Soul with rooms that breathed slowly, floors that creaked patient hellos, and windows that knew precisely how to frame morning light. Soul's sister Nia, barely 3 and wild with curiosity, followed the baby everywhere on bare feet that made no sound, asking questions that turned ordinary moments kinder. She would press her small nose to Soul's forehead and whisper secrets about where dust motes go when they disappear and why the kettle always sounds happy when it sings. Soul grew the way good bread rises, quietly, steadily, becoming more themselves with each passing day. They learned to crawl across sun-warmed floors, feeling the house's memories settled deep in the wood grain, like rings in an ancient tree. These were memories that tasted of earth after rain, of honest laughter and tears that had been earned through living. The crescent on their wrist would rest peacefully during these moments, content as a cat in a sunny window. Then Uncle Cornelius arrived. He appeared one Sunday evening as if he'd simply stepped back into a photograph where he'd always belonged, carrying the scent of cedar and distant rain. His smile fit perfectly into the spaces where family warmth had been waiting, and his laugh filled corners that hadn't known they were empty. He hung his good hat on the kitchen hook and settled at the dinner table like a puzzle piece finding its proper place. Elena brightened the way flowers do when clouds finally part, bustling around the kitchen with renewed purpose. She made sandwiches with the careful attention of someone arranging small altars to love, thick slices of bread, tomatoes cut into perfect circles, lettuce leaves arranged like green lace. David poured coffee and spoke of old times with the comfortable ease of brothers who'd shared countless conversations, though something flickered briefly in his eyes like a question that started to form and then dissolved. Uncle Cornelius told stories that slotted seamlessly into family history, filling gaps with memories so perfect they seemed almost too good to be true. He spoke of summer afternoons when David won prizes at county fairs, of Elena's childhood cat who could predict thunderstorms, of picnics where every sandwich tasted exactly right and no one ever forgot the blanket. His stories were beautiful as spun sugar, delicate and sweet, melting on the tongue without quite filling the belly. Soul, propped in their high chair with tiny fists wrapped around a teething ring, watched Uncle Cornelius with the patient attention of someone learning a new language. When their uncle laughed, the crescent on Soul's wrist grew warm, not with alarm but with recognition. When he told stories of memories that felt rehearsed rather than lived, the birthmark pulsed gently, a compass needle seeking true north through a field of beautiful fabrications. The sensation wasn't unpleasant, merely different. Uncle Cornelius's presence tasted like cotton candy, pretty, dissolving, leaving sweetness that didn't quite nourish. His stories had the texture of dreams remembered too clearly, edges too smooth, colors too bright. Soul felt a soft tingling spread from wrist to heart, not a warning but an acknowledgement, the house itself placing a gentle hand on their shoulder and whispering, "Pay attention, little one. Learn to taste the difference between what grows from soil and what grows from longing." Elena served Uncle Cornelius seconds without being asked, cutting the crusts from his sandwich the way she did for Nia. Though she couldn't quite remember when she'd learned his preferences, David clapped their guest's shoulder, and spoke of shared adventures that felt familiar as old songs, even though the melodies seemed newly composed. The evening stretched golden and warm, filled with the particular contentment that comes when hearts find exactly the shape of comfort they'd been missing. When Uncle Cornelius finally rose to leave, promising to return next Sunday with more stories to share, Saul watched him fade slightly at the edges like watercolor before it dries. The crescent cooled to its usual gentle warmth as the front door closed behind their visitor, and Elena and David stood in the hallway, speaking tenderly about how good it felt to have family fill the empty spaces again. Saul lay in their crib that night, listening to the house settle into sleep, pipes ticking lullabies, the refrigerator humming contentment, branches tapping patient rhythms against windows. The crescent rested quiet against their wrist, holding the memory of that first lesson in tasting borrowed light. Outside, the last meteors skated behind clouds, too shy to be seen, while Saul learned to hold questions gently without needing immediate answers. Some visitors to the heart, they understood in the wordless way children understand important things, come not to deceive, but to fill the spaces where love has been waiting. The gift would be learning to bless such kindness, while still recognizing the difference between what feeds the soul and what merely comforts it. As weeks folded into months like pages in a well-loved book, Saul learned to walk during the season, when Uncle Cornelius's visits became as predictable as morning light, painting the kitchen walls gold. Their first steps carried them not toward toys or outstretched arms, but toward the corner where their uncle's stories pooled like warm honey, sweet and somehow weightless. The crescent on their wrist had grown more conversational with each passing Sunday, warming gently when artificial memories brushed against real ones, cooling to its natural luminescence when truth settled back into its proper place like dust finding rest. Nia appointed herself Saul's translator and guide, following her younger sibling with the patient devotion of someone who understood that important discoveries happened slowly, like flowers deciding when to bloom. She would sit cross-legged beside Saul's blanket, her bare feet making no sound on the worn wooden floors, pointing to objects and whispering their secret names, the ones that only children and very old houses remembered. The lamp became the golden shepherd, the rocking chair transformed into the wooden grandmother, and Uncle Cornelius became the Sunday story man who tastes like clouds. Was Nia who first taught Saul to listen underneath. Conversations for the heartbeat that never lied. "Real things have weight," she would whisper, pressing smooth pebbles into Saul's palm. "Almost real things float." She had learned this from watching Saul's crescent pulse during family dinners, understanding in the wordless way that sisters understand each other's languages before words are even necessary. Eleanor's Sunday ritual had evolved into something approaching ceremony. She would wake early to knead bread dough with the reverence of someone arranging small altars to love, humming lullabies that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves, melodies inherited through generations of women who understood that food prepared with intention carries its own form of magic. Her sandwiches became more elaborate as Uncle Cornelius's stories grew more detailed. Thick slices of honey wheat, tomatoes cut into perfect circles, lettuce leaves arranged like green lace. Each creation was a testament to her belief that love could be layered between bread and served on the good plates. Yet Saul began to notice that some of Elena's humming carried different textures now. The old lullabies, the ones that tasted of earth after rain and honest salt from tears both joyful and sorrowful, would settle in the chest like warm stones, grounding and substantial. But newer melodies, the ones that arrived alongside Uncle Cornelius's fabricated adventures, floated rather than anchored, sweet as spun sugar, but dissolving on the tongue without quite nourishing the soul. The house itself seemed to be learning alongside Saul, its old bones creaking different songs, depending on which type of memory filled its rooms. The kettle on the stove began offering gentle commentary, its whistle carrying warnings threaded into steam about waters that were too calm, adventures that ended too perfectly. "Careful," it would sigh as Uncle Cornelius described fireworks displays that no one had organized. But everyone insisted they'd seen. Sweet is not always nourishing. The porch boards developed their own vocabulary of caution, groaning softly when artificial nostalgia approached the front door. Saul would crawl to the window and press small palms against the glass, watching as Uncle Cornelius materialized at the garden gate like morning mist, taking human shape. His arrival always coincided with moments when the family's longing for connection felt most tender. After David had worked late into the evening, when Elena had spent long afternoons missing her own scattered siblings, when Nia had asked why some families seemed fuller than others, David continued to welcome each new arrival with a heart as open as Bellwether's generous sky. Sometimes Uncle Cornelius brought companions, a cousin whose name settled easily on Elena's tongue, an old friend who knew exactly where the hallway floor squeaked. David would clap them on the back with tears of joy that felt both genuine and strangely universal, as if he were remembering a feeling more than a specific person. He spoke of shared childhood summers with these new relatives, memories that arrived fully formed, like gifts left on doorsteps overnight. Soul's gift, manifested in small ways that no one else seemed to notice. When Uncle Cornelius told stories of summers spent building tree houses that never fell, Saul would taste cotton candy, pretty, dissolving, leaving sweetness that didn't quite fill the belly. When Elena shared stories of her grandmother's patient hands, teaching her to fold napkins into swans, Saul would taste bread that had risen slowly in careful ovens, substantial, nourishing, settling in the heart like truth finally finding its home. The crescent had become Saul's compass, pointing toward authentic connection, not with alarm but with gentle recognition. They understood in the wordless way that children understand profound things, that Uncle Cornelius wasn't trying to harm their family. He was more like a moth drawn to the warm light of their contentment, feeding on their capacity for love, while offering beautiful fabrications in return. The exchange wasn't entirely unfair. His presence filled spaces in their hearts that had been waiting to be filled, even if the filling was temporary as morning dew. As autumn painted Bellwether's trees in honest shades of gold and crimson, Searle took their first independent steps toward the kitchen table, where Eleanor was preparing Sunday's feast. The crescent pulsed gently as they approached, not with warning but with recognition. Here was authentic love expressing itself through careful attention to detail, through the patient ritual of making something beautiful for those who mattered most. Searle reached tiny fingers toward their mother's humming, understanding that some melodies were inherited through blood and bone, while others were borrowed from the tender spaces where hearts reached toward each other across the vast, mysterious distances that separate one soul from another. In the distance beyond the garden fence, where daisies practiced standing tall, an old building waited with windows like folded hands. Searle noticed it sometimes during evening walks, the library, quiet as a kept promise, holding a different sort of light. They would go there when it was time. For now the kettle finished a sentence only Saul could hear, and Nia pressed another pebble into their palm like a blessing, and the house accepted both true and almost true footsteps with equal patience, while the sky tucked Bellwether in, one slow star at a time. As Saul's understanding deepened with each passing week, so did the parade of gentle visitors to their home on Maple Street. Aunt Beatrice arrived with pies that tasted exactly like the ones Elena's grandmother might have baked, their crusts crimped to perfection. Cousin Finn brought stories of childhood adventures with David, tales so vivid that David would sometimes pause mid-laugh, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before melting into fond recognition. Each new arrival came bearing perfectly formed histories and ready-made affection, filling gaps the family hadn't realized were there. Saul watched from their corner by the window, the crescent on their wrist pulsing gently as these beautiful fabrications settled into Sunday dinners like missing puzzle pieces. The house itself seemed to strain slightly under the weight of so many borrowed memories. The kettle's whistle carried warnings about waters that were too calm. The porchboards groaned with stories that felt rehearsed rather than lived. Yet Saul felt no alarm, only a tender curiosity about where such visitors came from and why they chose their particular family to call home. The pull toward the library came on a Tuesday morning when fog hung low enough to touch, transforming Bellwether's familiar streets into something soft and dreamlike. Eleanor had bundled Saul for errands, but as they passed the old brick building with windows like patient eyes, Saul's crescent began to pulse with a different rhythm entirely. Not the gentle warning they'd grown accustomed to, but something deeper, like recognition meeting recognition across a crowded room. The library's wooden doors stood slightly ajar, despite the early hour, releasing the scent of old paper, and something else that tasted like truth allowed to age gracefully in quiet corners. Sol tugged at Elena's hand with the insistence of someone who had suddenly remembered an important appointment they'd never actually made. And Elena, charmed by her child's fascination, settled into a nearby chair while Sol began their first real exploration of this place that breathed differently than other buildings. Behind the circulation desk stood a woman with eyes, like folded linen and hair the color of autumn afternoons. Her name was Aura, though she wore it lightly like a favorite sweater softened by countless gentle washings. She looked up from her work, as if she'd been expecting them, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words. "Well," Aura said, her voice carrying the texture of pages, turning in comfortable silence. "Look who's finally decided to visit." She spoke to Sol as if they were old friends, resuming a conversation temporarily interrupted by the business of growing up. The crescent warmed with the particular contentment that came from being truly seen. Aura guided Sol through corridors where books arranged themselves in patterns that suggested they moved, slightly when no one was looking, reorganizing according to needs that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. She settled Sol in a chair that seemed designed specifically for such conversations and placed 2 identical spoons on a small wooden tray between them. "This is a simple game," Aura explained. "Both spoons weigh the same, but one will feel heavier to you. The heavier one belongs to a memory that grew in soil. The lighter one belongs to a memory that grew in yearning." Sol studied the spoons, not with their eyes first, but with their wrist, feeling the crescent warm as they closed fingers around the left spoon. It carried the quiet insistence of something rooted, while the right felt bright and hollow, like a bubble catching afternoon light. "That's how it is," Aura murmured approvingly. "Truth carries a little weight, not heaviness exactly, more like a resting place. Comfort can be light enough to float away. Both have their uses. Not everything needs to be kept." She poured tea from her own thermos, steam rising in ribbons that braided with the sound of rain beginning against glass. The library, Aura explained, rearranged itself each night according to the emotional needs of its visitors. Books about authentic connection would migrate toward stories of emotional parasites, creating conversations between covers that helped people understand the difference between being loved and being fed upon. As she spoke, Sol watched a photograph on the nearby table, a picture of the town green where a blur near the picnic area tried to sharpen into an unfamiliar smile, then softened back into background when it felt observed. "When you name the feeling," Aura whispered, her words settling in Sol's chest like warm stones. "The feeling doesn't have to pretend to be a person. Say this is loneliness, and it won't disguise itself as an uncle. Say this is gratitude, and it won't dress up like a debt." She showed Sol sections where books glowed faintly, stories of creatures who fed on human longing for family, creating artificial bonds that felt real enough to sustain them but left their hosts somehow emptier. Sol spent the afternoon learning to distinguish between volumes that felt grounded and substantial and those that seemed to float just slightly above their shelves. Some books settled in Sol's small hands like sleeping cats, content and solid. Others felt light as soap bubbles, pretty but insubstantial, dissolving at the edges when examined too closely. As afternoon light painted golden rectangles on the worn carpet, Aura shared the library's most important secret. Some visitors to our hearts arrive because we've been lonely. Others arrive because we've been ready for love. Learning to tell the difference, that's the work of a lifetime. You won't need to tear the false ones away. Offer tea to the feeling underneath. When it's warm, it often lets go of the mask on its own. Walking home through fog-softened streets, Sol carried new understanding like a small lamp in their chest. Uncle Cornelius would arrive for Sunday dinner as always, bringing his cotton candy stories and borrowed light. But now Sol understood they didn't have to choose between kindness and discernment. They could offer both, like setting an extra place at the table, while still knowing which guests would fade with the dawn. The house welcomed them with its familiar creaking lullaby, and somewhere in the distance, the library's windows glowed softly as books rearranged themselves for tomorrow's visitors, preparing conversations between covers that would help other hearts learn to taste the difference between what feeds the soul and what merely comforts it. The crescent pulsed once with quiet satisfaction, having found a place where questions could be held gently, without requiring immediate answers, where wisdom arrived, not as instruction but as recognition of what the heart already knew. The wisdom from Aura's library settled into Sol's understanding, the way morning dew finds its proper place on patient grass, slowly, naturally, without announcement. In the days that followed their first visit to that place where books rearranged themselves according to unspoken needs, Sol began to notice how their home held different textures of memory, some rooted deep as oak trees, others floating light as dandelion, seeds on summer breezes. It was while helping Elena organize the wooden chest beneath the hall window that Sol's fingers brushed against something that made their crescent pulse with gentle recognition. Nestled between lavender sachets and folded quilts lay a photograph from the previous summer's picnic, its edges soft with handling, its colors warm as honey in afternoon light. The image captured a perfect bellwether day, checkered blankets spread beneath the ancient oak, baskets overflowing with Elena's careful sandwiches. David's laugh caught mid-expression while Nia chased butterflies through dappled shade, but there was another face smiling from the frame, a woman with silver hair and eyes that crinkled with manufactured joy, her arm draped around Elena's shoulders with the easy familiarity of decades shared. Sol studied this extra presence, feeling the particular lightness that came when borrowed memories tried to convince themselves they had always belonged. "Oh, look at Aunt Millicent," Elena murmured, lifting the photograph with reverence reserved for sacred things. "She made the most wonderful elderflower cordial that day. Remember how she taught you to braid daisy chains, Sol?" Elena's voice carried the texture of genuine affection, her fingers tracing the stranger's face with undeniable fondness, though Sol's crescent warmed with the recognition that this memory tasted like spun sugar, sweet, dissolving, leaving no lasting nourishment. David paused in his passage through the hallway, drawn by Elena's nostalgic tone. "Millicent!" he exclaimed, his face brightening with tears that felt both authentic and strangely universal. What stories she told about her travels to places that sounded too beautiful to be real. I can still hear her laugh echoing across the creek. He spoke with the conviction of someone remembering a feeling, more than a specific person, his joy genuine even as it fed on fabrication. Sol felt their first deep ache of growing older, that particular sadness that accompanies expanding understanding. These visitors to their family's heart weren't malicious invaders but gentle thieves drawn to the warmth of authentic connection, feeding on their capacity for love while offering beautiful illusions in return. The exchange wasn't entirely unfair, but it left something hollow afterward, like eating sweets instead of bread and wondering why hunger returned so quickly. The next morning, Sol convinced Eleanor to visit the bakery, where Raffi worked alongside his father. Kneading dough before dawn painted Bellwether's streets gold. They found him arranging croissants with the careful attention of someone creating small altars to nourishment, his hands already dusted with flour despite the early hour. When Raffi looked up and saw Sol approaching, his face brightened with the particular recognition that passes between people who speak uncommon languages. "You're learning to taste the difference," Raffi observed, wiping his hands on his apron with unhurried grace. He guided Sol to a corner table where morning light pooled warm and private. "My grandmother taught me about pictures that change themselves. Some frames are like shallow ponds. If you stare long enough, they show you the sky that wants to be there, not the one that was." Raffi shared a photograph from his own family's collection, where his deceased grandfather appeared to be celebrating a birthday alongside living relatives, his presence so natural that questioning it felt like questioning sunrise itself. "We keep it because it brings comfort," Raffi explained, offering Sol bread that tasted like earth and honest rain. "But we also know he's visiting from our missing him, not from actually being there. They're like moths drawn to warm light, not evil, just hungry for the feeling of belonging." Walking home through streets where autumn painted honest colors on patient trees, Sol carried new questions alongside Aura's gentle wisdom. How could they honor these beautiful borrowings while protecting the authentic connections that truly nourished their family's heart? How could they bless the longing that created such visitors without allowing it to consume the real relationships that required daily tending? That evening, as Uncle Cornelius settled into his familiar chair and began weaving stories that felt rehearsed rather than lived, Sol practiced the art of generous observation. They watched Elena's face brighten with artificial memories, noted David's tears that felt both genuine and borrowed, observed how these fabrications filled spaces in their hearts while somehow leaving them emptier afterward. The crescent pulsed gently as Saul learned to hold two truths simultaneously. These visitors brought real comfort to their family, and they weren't quite real themselves. The gift lay not in choosing one truth over the other, but in learning to bless both, the authentic longing that created beautiful illusions and the genuine connections that grew, slowly in soil enriched by honest attention. In the photograph, tucked back among Elena's treasures, Aunt Millicent's smile seemed to soften slightly when Saul looked directly at it. As if the image itself understood, it was being seen clearly for the first time. The house settled into evening with its familiar symphony of creaking boards and sighing pipes, while somewhere in the distance, the library's windows glowed softly as books prepared new. Conversations about the delicate art of loving what is real, while blessing what merely feels good. The understanding that had bloomed in Saul's chest during their library. Visits with Aura began to deepen as autumn painted Bellwether in honest shades of gold and crimson. Word of the town's annual ritual arrived through the same gentle channels that carried the scent of baking bread and the whisper of turning pages. Aura mentioned it while reshelving books that had rearranged themselves overnight. Rafi slipped a flour-dusted note into their morning loaf, and even the kettle seemed to hum with anticipation as Elena unfolded instructions written in patient handwriting. Come to the green at midnight. Bring bread made with intention. Bring gratitude for what has comforted you. Bring readiness to release what was never meant to be kept. Elena approached her bread-making with the reverence usually reserved for sacred ceremonies, rising before dawn to knead dough that would spend the day growing slowly in the patient darkness of covered bowls. Sol watched from their corner by the kitchen window as their mother worked, her hands moving with the practiced grace of someone who understood that food prepared with intention carries its own form of blessing. The kitchen filled with warmth that settled in the chest, like truth finally finding its home, and Sol's crescent pulsed gently as they recognized the difference between this authentic ritual and the borrowed memories that had been visiting their Sunday dinners. We take one bite for each memory that needs to float back to the sky, Elena explained while shaping small rounds perfect for midnight hands. Some visitors to our hearts arrive when we're lonely, others when we're ready for love. Both deserve gratitude before they return to where they belong. Her words carried the particular cadence of inherited wisdom, lessons learned in childhood and polished, smoothed by countless retellings through generations, of women who understood the delicate art of letting go. David spent the days before the ritual walking through their house with the careful attention of someone taking inventory of treasures both real and almost real. He paused before photographs where extra faces smiled with manufactured joy, whispered gratitude to the longing that had created such beautiful illusions, prepared his heart for the gentle goodbye that would create space for authentic connections to deepen. Nia appointed herself Sol's guide to the ceremony's deeper meanings, pressing smooth pebbles into their palm-like blessings, while explaining that the almost real people weren't mean, just lost on their way to somewhere else. Uncle Cornelius seemed to understand what was approaching with the graceful acceptance of someone who had always known they were visiting rather than staying. His stories grew softer that week, less insistent, carrying the particular sadness of a guest preparing to take respectful leave. When he looked at Sul during their final Sunday dinner together, something like relief moved across his face. Not defeat, but the peace of a candle allowed to be a candle, rather than trying to illuminate an entire room. The night of the ceremony arrived wrapped in fog that transformed Bellwether's familiar streets into something soft and dreamlike. Families emerged from warm houses, carrying baskets of midnight bread and lanterns that bobbed like fireflies through the gentle darkness. The town green had been transformed into sanctuary, with blankets spread beneath the ancient oak and candles arranged in circles that suggested sacred geometry without demanding explanation. Aura stood beneath the oak's patient branches, her voice carrying the texture of pages turning in comfortable silence as she spoke words that felt both ancient and newly born. We gather to bless what has fed us and what has comforted us, understanding that nourishment and comfort serve different purposes in the architecture of love. Some memories grow from soil, others from yearning. Both deserve gratitude before they return to the sky. Sol felt their crescent warm as families around the green began sharing bread with the reverence of communion, taking bites for memories that needed to float back to their proper place among patient stars. They watched as Uncle Cornelius approached their family, his borrowed form already beginning to shimmer slightly at the edges, growing translucent as the genuine affection that had sustained him was offered freely rather than clung to desperately. Elena embraced him with tears that felt both grateful and liberating, while David pressed bread into his translucent hands with the tenderness of someone offering blessing rather than goodbye. "Thank you for keeping the chairs warm," Saul said, the words surprising their own mouth with how right they felt. "We know how to keep them warm now." Uncle Cornelius nodded with the particular grace of someone who'd been waiting for permission to do what comes next. "I liked your mother's humming," he admitted, his voice holding gratitude's soft grain. "I liked your father's stories." He lifted Saul's offered bread to his lips but did not bite, holding it like a pilgrim holds a stone picked up at exactly the right bend in the road. As dawn painted the horizon in honest shades of rose and gold, the artificial visitors lifted like balloons that were never meant to be kept, their borrowed forms dissolving into morning mist, while the authentic connections that remained settled deeper into the soil of daily tending. Saul felt the particular contentment that comes when truth finally finds its proper weight, understanding that their role wasn't to expose these gentle thieves, but to help authentic memories grow stronger roots, to bless rather than banish, to protect the delicate ecosystem of the heart. Walking home through streets where morning light painted golden rectangles on patient sidewalks, Saul carried new understanding like a small lamp in their chest. The beautiful borrowings would return when loneliness created spaces for them to fill, but now their family knew how to welcome such comfort without mistaking it for lasting nourishment. How to say thank you while choosing what to nurture, with the daily attention that transforms acquaintance into authentic love. The weeks that followed, Bellwether's midnight ceremony carried a different quality of light, as if the air itself had been cleansed of something beautiful but insubstantial. Saul's family moved through their daily routines with the particular grace that comes when authentic connections settle into their proper weight. Conversations felt more grounded, laughter carried deeper resonance, and even the silences between them held the comfortable texture of truth allowed to breathe freely. It was during one of these newly quiet mornings that Saul first noticed the baker standing in his shop window before dawn, kneading dough while speaking tenderly to someone who wasn't quite there. The early light painted everything gold and patient, transforming the bakery into a place where ordinary moments touched the edge of something sacred. Saul pressed small palms against the cool glass of their bedroom window, watching as the baker shaped loaves while carrying on what appeared to be the most natural conversation in the world. The baker's name was Thomas, though he wore it gently like a favorite sweater, softened by countless washings. His hands moved with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to dance with invisible partners, dividing dough into portions that seemed calculated for two sets of hands. Though only his were visible in the growing light, Saul's crescent pulsed with gentle recognition, but this warmth carried a different texture than they'd felt with Uncle Cornelius or the other Sunday visitors. Elena noticed Saul's fascination during their morning walk past the bakery. "He lost his daughter 3 summers ago," she explained softly, her voice holding the particular reverence reserved for grief that has learned to wear beautiful clothes. Sometimes love creates its own company, when the missing becomes too heavy to carry alone. That afternoon, Saul convinced Elena to visit during the quiet hour, when most of Bellwether rested in comfortable drowse. They found Thomas arranging pastries with the careful attention of someone creating small altars to nourishment. When he looked up and saw Saul approaching, his face brightened with the recognition that passes between people who speak uncommon languages. "You're the child who sees clearly," Thomas observed, wiping flour-dusted hands on his apron. He guided them to a corner table, where afternoon light pooled warm and private. "My dawn daughter visits when the grief gets too quiet. She helps with the morning bread, tells jokes that sound like her mother's laugh, reminds me that love doesn't end just because breathing stops." Saul felt their crescent warm as Thomas spoke, but this presence tasted different from the borrowed memories that had visited their family. This visitor carried substance, like bread that had risen slowly in careful ovens, nourishing while acknowledging its own temporary nature. Thomas's dawn daughter wasn't feeding on loneliness, but growing from authentic love. A bridge built from grief that had learned to wear gratitude's patient clothes. She only appears with first light, Thomas continued, offering Sol bread that carried the honest weight of grain grown in local soil. Helps me remember that mourning can be a form of tending, that missing someone is just love with nowhere to go. When the sun gets too high, she fades like morning mist, but the warmth stays with me through the day. Sol remembered Aura's gentle wisdom about naming feelings so they wouldn't have to pretend to be people. Would you like to give her tea? Sol asked, the words surprising their own mouth with how right they felt. Thomas blinked, then smiled at the oddness, then understood. The next morning, Sol arrived as darkness softened toward dawn. Thomas had prepared a small cup beside his workstation, steam rising from warm milk touched with honey. To what are we saying thank you? Sol asked, keeping their voice gentle as morning light. Thomas's flour-dusted hands rested on the table. To wanting one more morning with her, he said, and the truth in it settled in the room like a bird returning to its branch. To love that outlived its container. As the first sunlight painted the bakery windows gold, Sol felt the crescent pulse with deep, resonant peace. The wisp of the dawn daughter, usually so clear in Thomas's mind, seemed to shimmer gently, not departing but transforming, from a presence that needed to be sustained to a memory that could sustain itself. Thank you for keeping the mornings warm, Thomas whispered to the brightening air. And Sol understood this wasn't goodbye but recognition. The dawn daughter had never been trying to replace what was lost, but helping Thomas. Remember that love creates its own forms of comfort when the heart grows, ready to receive them, walking home through streets where morning painted honest shadows on patient sidewalks. Sol carried new understanding like a small lamp in their chest. Some visitors to the heart arrived from loneliness seeking to be filled, while others grew from love, learning new ways to express itself. Both deserved blessing, but only authentic love created visitors that left their hosts somehow more themselves rather than emptier afterward. The house welcomed them with its familiar symphony, while somewhere in the distance, Thomas prepared dough with hands that remembered being guided by smaller ones. His grief transformed from a wound into a bridge, connecting what was lost to what remained. Sol's crescent settled into its gentle glow, understanding that helping others taste the difference between memories that nourish and those that merely comfort was becoming as natural as breathing, as necessary as dawn arriving to bless another day's patient. Unfolding, the understanding that had settled in Sol's heart after helping Thomas recognize his dawn daughters. True nature began to pull them toward the edge of Bellwether, where the town tipped its face toward the endless conversation between land and sea. It wasn't urgency that drew them to the lighthouse, more a patient invitation that arrived with the salt air, the sort that asks nothing while somehow making room for everything that needs to be held. The path to the lighthouse curved along sand that remembered 1,000 careful footsteps, gulls lifting and settling like scraps of linen on the patient breeze. The tower itself rose from weathered stones, with the certainty of an old story retold at just the right pace, its glass eye watching horizons with the kind of attention that understands how much happens in the spaces between heartbeats. Elder June greeted, Sol as if they had stepped into a conversation, paused only for the length of a kettle's gentle boil. Their hair carried silver touched by salt wind, their sweater mended in places with thread that didn't match on purpose, small bright stitches that whispered, "Repair is also art." They poured tea into 2 chipped cups and passed one across with the care of someone handing over a sleeping bird. "You've been learning to tell truth by its resting weight," June observed, glancing at Sol's crescent, which answered with soft recognition. "Now you'll learn what to do when a moment feels too thin to hold what it needs to carry." Jun took a strip of blue cloth from a nearby hook and stretched it gently between weathered hands. "Time is like this," they murmured, voice carrying the texture of waves finding their rhythm on patient stone. "If you pull it fast, it tears. If you coax it with breath, it lengthens." Most people let moments pour through them like sand through fingers. But you can learn to hold the sieve differently. Create space where recognition can bloom. They demonstrated by breathing slowly, deliberately, as if each exhale was making room for something precious to settle. "Breath is a leash you can loosen," June whispered. "When you find yourself rushing, or when the almost real feels too insistent, simply lengthen the space between inhaling and letting go. In that pause, clarity often finds its way home. Saul felt their crescent warm as understanding bloomed. This wasn't about stopping time, but about consciously expanding the present, creating pockets where truth could be tasted without hurry. They practiced by the lighthouse window, watching waves roll in with their ancient, unhurried rhythm, learning to stretch moments like soft scarves until they held space for deeper seeing. The technique found its first real test when Mrs. Chen arrived that afternoon, clutching a photograph that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles. The image showed her late husband standing beside a garden that had never existed in their backyard, his arm around flowers that bloomed in colors too perfect for earthly soil. "I spend hours each day tending this garden," she whispered, her voice holding the particular exhaustion that comes from loving what isn't quite there. "But my real roses are dying while I water these phantom blooms." Saul placed gentle fingers on the photograph's edge and breathed the way June had taught them, stretching the moment like soft fabric until it held space for Mrs. Chen to taste the difference. The crescent pulsed with warm recognition as artificial sweetness dissolved into something more substantial. "This garden tastes like cotton candy," Mrs. Chen said after several quiet minutes, surprise and relief braiding through her words. "Pretty, but it melts on the tongue without nourishing. My real roses taste like bread, requiring daily attention, but feeding something deeper when tended with honest care." She folded the photograph with tender gratitude, understanding now that her husband's love lived not in fabricated perfection, but in the patient work of nurturing what was actually growing. As she walked home through afternoon light, Saul felt their gift expanding beyond simple recognition into something more generous, the ability to create sanctuaries within ordinary moments where people could pause long enough to choose what deserved their daily tending. "Some invitations are written on fog," Jun said as they watched Mrs. Chen's figure grow small against the horizon. "They can lead hearts astray when the weather inside grows too lonely. But in stretched time, people can feel the difference between what calls them toward authentic connection and what merely offers temporary shelter from missing what they've lost." Word began to spread through Bellwether's gentle networks about the lighthouse, where moments could be expanded, where breath could be loosened like a patient leash, where people could pause long enough to taste whether their memories nourished or merely comforted. Saul understood they were becoming something new, not just someone who could recognize borrowed light, but someone who could create space for others to make their own discoveries about what deserved to be kept and what could be blessed before being released. Walking home as the lighthouse beam began its nightly sweep across darkening waters, Saul carried June's wisdom like a small lamp in their chest. The world still held its beautiful fabrications, but now they possessed tools for helping hearts distinguish between what truly fed them and what merely satisfied temporary hunger. The crescent settled into its gentle glow, understanding that some gifts were meant to be shared like bread, broken and offered to anyone whose soul had grown weary from sustaining what was almost, but not quite, real. The gift of stretched time that June had taught Saul at the lighthouse began to weave itself into the fabric of their daily wanderings through Bellwether's patient streets. It was during one of these unhurried afternoons, when light fell through autumn leaves like scattered coins from heaven's pocket, that Saul first heard the laugh that rang true as temple bells echoing across the town square. The sound drew them up a narrow staircase tucked between the bookbinder's shop and the place where Mrs. Hartwell sold buttons, arranged like small galaxies in wooden trays. The stairs smelled faintly of laundry soap and rosemary, creaking a welcome in three-part harmony as they led to a rooftop garden where laundry lines stretched between chimneys like the rigging of ships anchored in sky. Among sheets that billowed white as patient clouds, a girl sat cross-legged beside a collection of mason jars filled with what appeared to be captured light. Her name was Lila, though she wore it like a favorite song hummed under breath, present but not insistent. Her hair caught afternoon sun and scattered it in directions that suggested she'd learned to befriend chaos rather than tame it. When she looked up and saw Saul approaching, her face brightened with the recognition that passes between people who speak uncommon languages. "You're the one who helps people taste the difference," Lila said, her voice carrying the texture of wind chimes touched by honest breezes. She gestured to the mason jars arranged around her, like a constellation of captured moments. I've been collecting borrowed light for years, trying to understand why some memories feel heavier than others. Saul settled beside her on the sun-warmed blanket, feeling their crescent pulse with gentle recognition. Each jar held light that seemed to shift between golden and silver, some glowing with the substantial warmth of truth, others flickering with the hollow brightness of beautiful fabrications. Lila had learned to gather these fragments of almost real experiences the way some people collect pressed flowers, not to possess them, but to study the delicate differences between what grows from soil and what grows from yearning. This one, Lila said, lifting a jar that pulsed with cotton candy sweetness, belongs to a memory of winning a piano recital that never happened. The joy feels real enough to sustain me for hours, but afterward I'm somehow hungrier than before. She set it down with the careful attention of someone handling a soap bubble. And this one holds the memory of my grandmother, teaching me to braid wildflowers. It tastes like bread that rose slowly in careful ovens, nourishing, grounding, settling in the heart like truth, finally finding its home. Saul didn't always follow Lila's sentences to their end, but they understood the longing that started them. Here was someone who carried her own collection of borrowed memories, traumas that weren't hers, joys that felt too perfect to be entirely real, sorrows that belonged to stories she'd heard rather than lived. Yet she held them all with the tenderness of a gardener, tending plants that might or might not take root. Sometimes I wonder if I'm more borrowed than real, Lila admitted, her voice carrying the texture of someone speaking a truth that had been waiting patiently to be named. So many of my strongest feelings came from stories I heard, dreams I had, wishes that felt more solid than actual events. Saul placed gentle fingers on Lila's wrist, feeling for the pulse that never lied. You taste like honest rain on summer dust, they said, the words surprising their own mouth with how right they felt. Borrowed light can't create its own heartbeat. As afternoon light painted golden rectangles across the rooftop, they learned each other's authentic silences. Lila spoke of nights when artificial memories felt more vivid than her actual childhood, when borrowed experiences seemed to offer more comfort than the sometimes difficult work of living in her own skin. Saul shared the weight of recognizing when family members were feeding on beautiful fabrications, the particular sadness of watching people choose temporary sweetness over lasting nourishment. They spent the remaining daylight counting satellites that appeared like shy stars in the deepening sky, making promises to nurture what was real, while gently releasing what merely felt good. Lila taught Saul to braid grass stems into crowns that would dissolve with morning dew, while Saul showed Lila how to breathe space into moments until they held room for recognition to bloom. Can you feel it? Saul asked, demonstrating June's technique of stretching time like soft fabric. The difference between what feeds you and what just fills the empty spaces. Lila closed her eyes and breathed the way Saul showed her, letting the moment expand until it held space for deeper seeing. Yes, she whispered, wonder threading through her voice. The borrowed ones feel light as cotton candy, pretty, but they melt on the tongue without nourishing. The real ones have weight, like stones you can build a foundation on. Walking home through streets where evening painted honest shadows on patient sidewalks, Saul carried new understanding like a small lamp in their chest. Some people collected borrowed light, not from loneliness but from hearts so generous. They wanted to hold more beauty than one lifetime typically offered. Learning to distinguish between authentic experience and beautiful borrowing wasn't about rejecting what felt good, but about choosing what truly fed the soul's deeper hungers. The house welcomed them with its familiar symphony of settling boards and sighing pipes, while somewhere above the rooftops, Lila arranged her jars of captured light according to patterns that honored both truth and longing. Saul's crescent settled into its gentle glow, understanding that some friendships were built not on shared experiences, but on the mutual recognition of hearts learning to taste the difference between what nourished them and what merely comforted them through the long, beautiful work of becoming more themselves. The friendship that had bloomed between Saul and Lila on that rooftop, stitched with laundry lines, grew the way good bread rises, quietly, steadily, becoming more itself with each shared afternoon. They met when shadows grew long and patient, comparing jars of captured light while learning each other's authentic silences. It was during one of these gentle gatherings that the air above Bellwether began to thicken with something that tasted like collective yearning. Clouds gathering not with the promise of rain, but with the weight of an entire town's longing-seeking form. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening, when the very atmosphere seemed to shimmer with possibilities that hadn't quite decided what they wanted to become. Searle felt their crescent begin to pulse with unusual intensity as artificial relatives materialized throughout the town, like flowers blooming all at once. Cheerful aunts appearing at kitchen tables, beloved cousins settling into porch swings, grandfathers emerging from garden sheds with tools they'd never actually owned, sisters who helped bakers knead dough before dawn, while their hands still moved with the lonely grace of solitary work. From their rooftop sanctuary, Searle and Lila watched as Bellwether transformed into something that looked like everyone's most perfect family reunion. Windows glowed with manufactured warmth. Laughter echoed from houses where solitary residents suddenly found themselves hosting dinner parties for relatives who felt familiar as childhood lullabies. The borrowed light was so thick it seemed to make the very air taste like spun sugar, sweet, dissolving, leaving a hollow ache where nourishment should settle. "It's beautiful," Lila whispered, her voice carrying wonder threaded with concern. "But look how tired everyone's becoming." She pointed to neighbors preparing elaborate meals for 7 extra guests while their shoulders sagged with exhaustion they couldn't quite name, to gardeners explaining their plants to cheerful uncles whose presence required constant emotional feeding while actual vegetables drooped neglected in the soil. Searle felt the particular sadness that comes when understanding arrives, wrapped in gentle urgency. This wasn't individual visitors like Uncle Cornelius, who had fed carefully on their family's capacity for connection. This was something larger, a collective hunger that had learned to wear the faces of everyone's deepest longings for belonging, creating artificial relatives so perfectly tailored to each heart's specific emptiness that questioning them felt like questioning love itself. "We need to gather people," Sewell said, their crescent now pulsing with steady warmth. "Not to fight this, but to help everyone remember the difference between what feeds them and what just fills the spaces." They descended through streets where artificial laughter echoed from every window, past gardens where borrowed relatives offered advice that sounded wise, but tasted like cotton candy. At the library they found Aura surrounded by books that had rearranged themselves into protective circles, volumes about authentic connection forming gentle barriers against stories that felt too perfect to be entirely true. "The longing has learned to organize itself," Aura observed, her voice carrying the texture of someone who had witnessed such weather before. "When enough hearts ache for the same thing, sometimes the yearning creates its own storm." She helped Sewell and Lila gather supplies, lanterns that burned with honest flame, bread that had risen slowly in patient ovens, tea that tasted like earth after rain. Word spread through Bellwether's gentle networks with the unhurried grace of important news that doesn't need to shout. June arrived from the lighthouse with candles arranged in patterns that suggested sacred geometry, without demanding explanation. Thomas brought baskets of dawn bread, his flour-dusted apron carrying the scent of grain grown in local soil. Rafi appeared with his grandmother's wisdom about recognizing pictures that changed themselves, while Mrs. Chen carried roses from her real garden, the ones that required daily tending but fed something deeper when nourished with honest attention. As midnight approached, they gathered on the town green beneath the ancient oak, whose patient branches had witnessed countless storms of longing. Searle stood among their circle of friends, feeling their crescent pulse with recognition as they understood. Their role wasn't to banish these beautiful fabrications, but to create space for people to choose what deserved their daily tending. "We're hosting a festival of grateful farewells," Aura announced, her voice carrying across the green to windows where artificial relatives glowed with borrowed light. "Not to take anything away, but to offer gratitude for all that has brought comfort, and to bless what needs to return to the sky." The festival began not with urgency, but with the patient rhythm of people sharing bread made with intention. They lit lanterns that burned with honest flame, each light a gentle invitation for hearts to pause long enough to taste whether their visitors were feeding them or merely satisfying temporary hunger. Searle moved through the gathering crowd, teaching June's art of stretching moments until they held space for recognition to bloom, helping people distinguish between what sustained them and what merely sheltered them from loneliness. As dawn painted the horizon in honest shades of rose and gold, The artificial relatives began to lift like morning mist, their borrowed forms dissolving not with violence, but with the natural grace of dreams returning to the sky. They weren't banished, they were thanked the way you thank a fairy when you reach the shore. People stood in their gardens holding real tools, sat at tables where authentic silence felt more substantial than manufactured laughter, remembered the patient work of tending connections that grew slowly in soil enriched by daily attention. Soul's crescent settled into its gentle glow as understanding bloomed. These storms of false nostalgia were indeed like weather, arriving when collective hearts grew thirsty, departing when they'd been offered what they truly needed. The gift lay not in preventing such weather, but in helping people taste the difference between what nourished them and what merely comforted them through the long, beautiful work of becoming more themselves. In the gentle aftermath of the Festival of Grateful Farewells, Bellwether exhaled like a town learning to breathe more deeply after holding its breath through a long, beautiful dream. The air felt cleaner in a way that had nothing to do with weather, and everything to do with the simple relief that follows honest naming. Windows shed their borrowed glow, kitchens returned to the dependable music of kettles and cutlery, and people carried their lanterns home the way you cradle a thought worth keeping. Soul walked through streets where morning painted honest shadows on patient sidewalks, their crescent warm but unhurried, the kind of glow that comes not from warning but from work done gently and well. Word moved through town the way important things always did in Bellwether, by whispered blessings and careful mouths of those who had been helped and were tender with each other's softness. They started calling Saul the Goodbye Whisperer, not as a title but as a description spoken with gratitude, as if naming the job too loudly might startle it away. It was Raffi who first used the phrase, flour dusting his lashes like winter's first thought, as he arranged morning pastries with the careful attention of someone creating small altars to nourishment. Special of the day, he'd tease with affection whenever Saul stopped by. 2 loaves of courage, 1 slice of honest goodbye, and a dollop of relief. He always added a second bag to Saul's order, bread still warm from the oven, something you eat standing up because it's too good to wait. Requests began arriving in the language of ordinary life, folded notes tucked into baskets of rolls, roses from Mrs. Chen's real garden, jars of captured light from Lila with ribbons tied around their necks. Each invitation said in its own handwriting, "Could you sit with me while I choose?" Soul answered the way wind answers chimes, understanding that their gift had evolved from simple recognition into something more generous, the ability to create sanctuaries within ordinary, moments where hearts could pause long enough to taste whether their visitors fed them or merely filled empty spaces. They visited Mr. Harlan, the retired postman who had been receiving letters in familiar handwriting from a brother he'd never actually had. Soul stretched time between breath and breath until Mr. Harlan could taste the ink for what it was, sweet as spun sugar, dissolving without nourishing. Together they stacked the letters in a ribboned bundle and set a cup of tea beside them. "For the feeling of wanting someone to keep my history with me," he said, voice steady as stone. The crescent warmed with quiet recognition. At the school, Miss Laurel had added a desk for a boy named Jonah, whom only she could see, marking his work with soft pencil and saving him sandwiches each day. Sol suggested they try taking attendance differently, calling out feelings instead of names. Students lifted their hands for loneliness, gratitude, hope, fear, laughing and sometimes crying as they recognized themselves in the roll call of human experience. When Miss Laurel finally said Jonah's name aloud, it sounded like a sigh returning to shore. They folded the extra desk back into the cupboard. "We'll keep the sandwich," she decided, smiling through tears, "for whoever's hungry after school." Lila walked beside Sewell more often now, their steps falling into the rhythm friendships discover when they stop trying to perform themselves. She carried jars of captured light for each visit, setting them on windowsills like small moons, while Sol demonstrated John's technique of breathing space into moments until they held room for recognition to bloom. Sometimes she said nothing, only listened with the kind of attention that turns words into home. As autumn deepened toward winter, Sol's reputation spread through networks that operated below the surface of ordinary conversation, whispered recommendations between librarians, notes passed between bakers, stories shared by lighthouse keepers who understood the difference between lights that guided ships safely home and those that led them toward beautiful but treacherous shores. Visitors began arriving from neighboring towns, carrying photographs that shifted when viewed from different angles, hearts heavy with the particular exhaustion that comes from loving what isn't quite there. Saul learned to hold each request with the patience of someone tending a garden where not every seed would sprout, understanding that recognition couldn't be forced, but only offered like bread to those whose hearts had grown ready to receive it. "When you name the feeling," they would say, echoing Aura's gentle wisdom, "the feeling doesn't have to pretend to be a person." Each evening, as street lamps hummed their familiar lullabies and clouds hung low enough to touch, Saul made their pact with the patient night: "I will keep what is true and bless what is almost." The crescent glowed with steady satisfaction whenever they honored this promise, understanding that some gifts were meant to be shared like bread, broken and offered to anyone whose soul had grown weary from sustaining what was almost, but not quite, real. The work of being Bellwether's goodbye whisperer had settled into Saul's bones like a familiar rhythm when winter arrived on quiet feet, bringing with it the first gentle signs that their own family would need the tender art they'd been offering to others. It began with small kindnesses that might have been overlooked if Saul hadn't learned to taste the difference between memories that grew from soil and those that grew from yearning. David reaching for a word and finding a neighboring one instead. Stories he'd always told in straight lines, beginning to meander like streams discovering more scenic paths through familiar landscapes. His memory didn't shatter, it softened, like pages in a well-loved book whose spine had grown gentle from countless careful readings. Saul first noticed it on a Tuesday morning when David smiled across the breakfast table and called them by Uncle Cornelius's name, his voice carrying the particular fondness reserved for someone beloved. "You were always such a careful listener," he said, laying his hand over Saul's with genuine warmth. The crescent on Saul's wrist pulsed not with the cotton candy lightness of borrowed visitors, but with something steadier, sadder, and entirely human, recognition of a mind beginning to choose comfort routes through landscapes that had grown too complex to navigate by ordinary maps. Saul didn't correct him. They let their hand rest beneath his, understanding that kindness could borrow costumes, while love remained the lasting truth beneath. Elena noticed too, though she carried her observations with the quiet grace of someone who understood that some changes needed acknowledgement, as gentle as sunrise painting familiar rooms in new light. She began leaving small notes throughout the house, breadcrumbs of daily routine scattered with patient attention. Dinner at 6, keys by the front door. Each message a small anchor thrown into waters that were growing deeper and less predictable. The house adjusted its songs to meet David where he was. The kettle's whistle softened into lower notes on mornings when he stared out windows longer than usual, tracing sparrow flights as if reading sentences written by their wings. Floorboards creaked patient hellos in response to his wandering, while Elena made simpler sandwiches, mustard spread the way David remembered from boyhood, bread cut into triangles because triangles seemed to return him to places where things still fit properly. Saul carried June's lesson about stretching time like a quiet tool in their pocket, using it often with David. When words jumbled and worry creased his brow, Saul breathed slowly, lengthening the space between inhaling and letting go, until rooms felt large enough to hold confusion without fear. In those expanded moments, David relaxed, looking at windows that transformed glass into water for seconds at a time, watching clouds shape themselves into ships before giving up the effort and returning to being only weather. Sometimes David called Saul by names that had belonged to long-departed artificial relatives, visitors who had once filled chairs, until the family learned to tend their own warmth. This recognition carried no bitterness, only tenderness deep as tide. Those gentle thieves had kept spaces ready. Now David's softening mind borrowed their names like blankets on chilly nights, and Saul tucked them around him without pulling them away. At the library, Aura had rearranged the front room with books, whose covers could be chosen by touch. Corduroy lines, linen textures, leather warmed by years of passing hands, so David could navigate by feeling rather than words that sometimes slipped just beyond reach. They sat by tall windows, while afternoon light thinned to pearl, David's eyes brightening at passages about rain on tin roofs and the particular exhaustion that follows days spent fixing things that stay fixed, at least for a while. Nia began visiting more often, bringing her children to fill the house with laughter that tasted like honest rain on summer dust. She would sit with David for hours, listening to stories that grew more elaborate with each telling, understanding that the important part wasn't whether adventures had happened but how they made him feel when he remembered loving them all. Lila arrived evenings with jars of captured light, setting ones that glowed steady and golden near David's chair, not as correction but as gentle accompaniment. "This one tastes like late afternoon in fields that need haying," David would say, his voice newly sure, and Sewell felt rooms thicken in the best way, full of air that remembered to include the past, without dragging it forcefully into the present. Walking through Bellwether's patient streets, Sewell carried new understanding like a small lamp in their chest. They had spent months helping others distinguish between what nourished and what merely comforted. But now they were learning that sometimes the most loving thing was to bless both, honoring authentic connections that remained, while allowing borrowed light to bring whatever comfort it could offer to hearts navigating by different stars. The crescent settled into its gentle glow, understanding that some forms of forgetting were their own kind of remembering. That love could outlive the container of specific memories, while continuing to fill rooms with warmth that required no explanation. Only grateful recognition of what remained constant, even as everything else learned new ways to be itself. Winter deepened around Bellwether like a patient blanket, and within that gentle hush, Nia's body grew round with the promise of new life. Sewell watched their sister navigate pregnancy with wonder that seemed to clarify something in the air itself. The way morning light grows more honest when it has important work to do. Nia hummed lullabies she couldn't remember learning, her voice threading through rooms where David listened with the particular attention of someone whose memory had learned to hold melodies longer than words, his softening mind somehow making space for what was approaching. The baby arrived on a morning when fog transformed Bellwether's familiar streets into something soft and dreamlike, as if the world had wrapped itself in gauze to better receive what was tender and new. They named her Miri, and her first cry sounded like tiny dawn breaking over water that had been waiting all night for sunrise. When Sewell first held their niece, the crescent on their wrist warmed not with recognition of borrowed light, but with something deeper, the presence of authentic life. Beginning its patient work of becoming itself, Elena moved through those first days with arms that seemed designed for exactly this kind of holding, making simpler meals that could be eaten one-handed while rocking a baby who tasted like honest rain on summer dust. The house adjusted its songs to welcome Miri, floors creaking patient hellos in three-part harmony, windows framing morning light, so it fell warm across corners where authentic love was learning to pool like golden honey. David approached his granddaughter with clarity that seemed to rise from some deeper well than daily memory. "She reminds me of mornings when everything fits properly," he said, his voice carrying the texture of someone who had found words that meant exactly what he needed them to mean. Sewell understood he was speaking their language now, recognizing truth by its resting weight, knowing love by how it settled in the chest, like stones you could build a foundation on. It was during Miri's second week home that Sewell noticed the change in their artificial visitors. The borrowed relatives who had once materialized at Sunday dinners now paused respectfully in doorways, drawn by the warm light of new life, but understanding that authentic love was pooling in spaces where a real child would learn to crawl. These gentle thieves seemed to recognize that Miri's presence required different kinds of attention, not the hollow sweetness of manufactured memories, but the substantial nourishment that comes from tending what grows slowly in soil, enriched by daily care. Uncle Cornelius appeared once more, shimmering slightly at the edges as he smiled at Miri sleeping in Sewell's arms. "She doesn't need extra relatives," he said with the graceful acceptance of someone who had always known they were visiting, rather than staying. "She has enough." His form grew translucent as morning light touched the windows, dissolving not with sadness, but with the peace of a candle allowed to complete its purpose. The family returned to simpler joys during those early weeks, slicing fruit into perfect circles while Miri watched from her basket, folding tiny shirts with the reverence reserved for sacred things, letting the kettle say hello in its honest voice, without requiring it to carry warnings about waters that were too calm. Lila visited evenings with fewer jars of captured light, understanding that some seasons called for different kinds of attention. She would sit cross-legged beside the rocking chair, telling stories about stars learning their names, while Miri's breathing settled into the rhythm that makes rooms feel safe. Saul learned to rock their niece while practicing. June's art of stretching time like soft fabric, creating pockets where recognition could bloom. In those expanded moments, they felt how David's softening memory had somehow prepared space for Miri's arrival, as if his mind's gentle letting go had created room for new forms of love to take root. The crescent pulsed with quiet satisfaction, understanding that some gifts were meant to be shared not through teaching but through witnessing how authentic connections require daily watering but feed something deeper when tended with honest attention. Walking through bellwethers, patient streets with Miri sleeping against their shoulder, Saul carried new understanding, like a small lamp in their chest. They had spent months helping others distinguish between what nourished and what merely comforted. But now they were learning that authentic love creates its own gravity, drawing real connections closer while allowing beautiful fabrications to find their proper distance. The borrowed light didn't disappear entirely, but it grew more respectful, visiting briefly before returning to whatever patient places such comfort lived when it wasn't needed. As winter softened toward spring, the house filled with sounds that tasted like truth, finally finding its home. Miri's contented breathing, David's soft humming, Elena's wordless lullabies braiding together into something that required no explanation, only grateful recognition of what remained constant, even as everything else learned new ways to be itself. A spring-painted bellwether in honest shades of green and gold, Saul noticed that Lila's breathing had grown gentler, not with alarm but with the particular quietness that arrives when souls begin preparing for their next transformation. The change came so gradually it seemed like weather. Lila moving more slowly through their rooftop conversations, pausing longer between sentences as if listening to something just beyond ordinary hearing. Her laugh still rang true as temple bells, but it carried new spaces between the notes, moments where silence felt like prayer, offered to whatever patient forces help hearts learn when it's time to reach toward different forms of loving. They spent those precious weeks sharing soup on Saul's porch, their conversations stitched with pauses that felt like blessings rather than interruptions. Eleanor made broths that tasted like late summer, tomatoes and thyme bred beside them for dipping, setting bowls down as if placing blessings rather than meals. David sat nearby, humming without words, his softening memory somehow remembering exactly how to accompany quiet days, while Miri reached tiny fingers toward dust motes dancing in window light, her presence creating the kind of authentic gravity that made borrowed visitors pause, respectfully in doorways before fading with dawn. Lila's jars of captured light grew fewer but more carefully chosen during those gentle afternoons, only those that glowed with the substantial warmth of memories that had grown in soil. Enriched by honest attention, she arranged them in patterns that suggested sacred geometry without demanding explanation. Small constellations of moments that had learned to shine with their own light, rather than reflecting borrowed brightness. "I've been thinking about intentional borrowing," Lila said one afternoon when clouds hung low enough to touch, her voice carrying the texture of someone speaking a truth that had been waiting patiently to be named. "What happens when we create beautiful fabrications on purpose, knowing they're not real but understanding they serve love's deeper purposes?" Together they crafted a memory with the solemnity of a soft spell, an afternoon that had never happened where they'd found an iridescent shell that hummed with forgotten wishes, where gulls sang lullabies and sand remembered every footprint. They spoke it into being with deliberate care, then sealed it lightly in one of Lila's jars, not to imprison it, but to keep it from evaporating before it could do its small, specific work. "We know it didn't happen," Lila whispered, smiling at their own audacity, "but let's keep it anyway, as a handkerchief for pockets we haven't discovered yet." Saul felt their crescent one with recognition that some borrowed light teaches hearts about the shape of what they're actually hungry for, that love sometimes wears the wrong costume while searching for its proper form. Aura visited during those twilight hours, carrying books that had rearranged themselves to face Lila like attentive birds. She placed a mended notebook in Saul's hands, its cover stitched with mismatched thread like June's patient sweater. "For your soft names," she said, voice carrying the texture of pages turning in comfortable silence. "You've been speaking them for a while." Words that help feelings stop pretending to be people. Now write them where other hands can find them. When time came to let Lila go, Sol stretched the moment as far as it would reach without breaking, using Jun's technique of breathing space into time until the porch felt vast enough to hold both the ache of parting and profound gratitude for what had been shared. In that expanded sanctuary, they felt how Lila's presence didn't vanish but transformed, becoming part of the warm light that pooled in corners where authentic love had learned to recognize itself. The goodbye tasted like morning mist returning to sky, not violent but natural, the way dreams dissolve when consciousness arrives to tend what needs daily attention. Lila's jars continued glowing softly in their new arrangement, including the one that held their intentional fabrication, humming like a low, faithful note that reminded Sol how borrowed light could serve authentic love when held with honest awareness. Walking through Bellwether's patient streets as evening painted honest shadows on sidewalks, Sol carried new understanding, like a small lamp in their chest. Some friendships were meant to teach the delicate art of holding what is precious, while understanding it isn't permanent, of blessing what almost while nurturing what truly feeds the soul through the long, beautiful work of becoming more itself. The notebook rested warm against their palm, waiting to be filled with soft names for feelings so they wouldn't need to wear the masks of people. Sol understood the next piece of work had already begun, to write down what they'd learned about helping hearts distinguish between what nourishes and what merely comforts, to leave gentle guidance where other travelers could find their way by honest light through the vast, mysterious distances that separate one soul from another while connecting them in ways that matter most. The notebook Aura had given Sol rested open on the kitchen table like a patient friend waiting for conversation, its mended spine breathing softly in the gentle hours when Bellwether held its breath between night and dawn. Sol began writing when street lamps hummed their familiar lullabies, filling pages with observations that had settled in their heart like truth finally finding its home. The first words came slowly, like water finding its way through new ground, soft names for feelings that had been pretending to be people. They wrote, "Homesick for what hasn't happened," beside a sketch of Uncle Cornelius, "Gratitude without a doorbell," next to Thomas's Dawn daughter, "Sweet Lonely" for the ache that created artificial relatives during Sunday dinners. Each name made a small landing place for emotions that might otherwise dress themselves up as borrowed, visitors and knock at family doors seeking sustenance they couldn't quite provide. Elena discovered the writing during one of her quiet morning rituals, settling beside Sol with tea that steamed like small prayers, rising toward patient ceiling. "You're teaching people to taste the difference," she observed, reading passages about setting extra places for feelings rather than fabricated people, about pouring tea for longings, while understanding what truly nourished versus what merely comforted. David wandered in during these sessions, his softening memory somehow finding clarity in the rhythm of pen, moving across paper, nodding at descriptions that felt exactly right even when he couldn't follow their complete logic. Words spread through Bellwether's gentle networks, the way important things always did, through whispered recommendations between librarians, notes passed between bakers, stories shared by lighthouse keepers. Aura contributed words like library breath and shelf wisdom, while Jern added loosen the leash of breath in careful margin notes. Thomas brought flower-dusted insights about dawn hunger, the kind of ache that wasn't pain, just room, and Raffi pressed crumbs of bread truth between pages like pressed flowers, marking important passages. Apprentices began arriving without introductions, as if the town itself had invited them. There was Ilara, whose family kept a perpetually set extra place for a brother lost at sea, a brother who occasionally materialized bearing gifts of phantom shells and impossible voyage stories. Sol taught her to set an extra cup for unresolved grief, to pour tea for the need for closure, giving feelings names so they wouldn't have to borrow her brother's face. Young Marcus arrived, carrying photographs where his deceased grandmother appeared at family gatherings she'd never attended, her presence so natural that questioning it felt like questioning love itself. Sol showed him how to stretch moments using Jun's technique, breathing space into time until he could taste the difference between memories that grew from soil and those that grew from yearning. "She visits from my missing her," he realized with relief, "not from actually being there." Saul met each apprentice in ordinary rooms and taught with ordinary things, 2 spoons identical on a scale, but different in the hand, pebbles smooth as kept promises, wedges of bread to share in silence while learning what nourished versus what merely satisfied. They opened the notebook and let the soft names do their work. When you call it by its true name, Saul would say, the feeling doesn't have to pretend to be a person. The teaching settled into gentle rituals that fit inside daily life. Set an extra plate, but label it clearly, for the ache. Pour a cup of tea, but name it aloud for the wish. Open a window, let weather answer what words cannot. Write letters addressed to feelings, not the people they borrowed. If photographs added smiles overnight, breathe until rooms widened, and say thank you before returning attention to what remained when help went home. Questions grew kinder as weeks unspooled. What do I keep when everything wants to stay? Keep the work, the laughter that didn't require perfect endings, the quiet that holds without asking for performance. What do I release? The parts that only glow when stared at too hard. How do I know I'm not throwing away love? Love doesn't dissolve when you stop feeding it fantasies. It sits beside you and asks for soup. Miri wandered through these learning sessions, her toddler presence creating authentic gravity that made borrowed visitors pause respectfully before fading with dawn. She would reach tiny fingers towards Saul's crescent, which pulsed with steady recognition, a constant reminder of the gift that had started it all, the ability to distinguish between what grew from soil and what grew from longing. As summer painted bellwether in honest shades of gold and green, the notebook grew thick with gentle guidance, written in language that tasted like earth after rain. Saul understood they were creating something like a field guide for emotional weather, helping hearts navigate the vast distances between authentic connection and beautiful borrowing. The crescent settled into its gentle glow as Saul wrote closing passages, understanding that some gifts were meant to be shared like bread, broken, and offered to anyone whose soul had grown weary from sustaining what was almost, but not quite, real. The apprentices would carry small kits when they departed. A spoon, a pebble, pages of soft names, recipes for bread that rose slowly. They left notes on Saul's windowsill. Today I kept the meal and thanked the story. Today I called it Afterlight, and it stopped pretending to be a person I had to keep. The notebook would find its way to other hands, other hearts learning the delicate art of blessing, both while choosing what to tend with daily attention that transforms acquaintance into authentic love. Years folded into each other like pages in a well-loved book, and the notebook had grown thick with gentle wisdom, its margins filled with flour dust from Rafi's bakery and salt air from June's lighthouse visits. Saul sat on the porch swing as evening painted bellwether in honest shades of gold and amber. Miri curled against their side like a small cat seeking warmth. She was 3 now, with questions that made rooms kinder and bare feet that found music in creaking floorboards. David hummed wordlessly nearby, his memory continuing its soft transformation, choosing scenic routes through familiar landscapes, rather than the straight lines he'd once navigated with certainty. Sometimes he called Saul by Uncle Cornelius's name, sometimes Lila's, his love remaining constant as sunrise while requiring no correction, only the warm acceptance of hearts that had learned to taste truth by its resting, weight rather than its perfect. Recall, it was while turning the notebook's final pages that Saul discovered it, the mysterious letter that had arrived with their birth, now aged to the color of autumn afternoons, resting between recipes for bread that rose slowly and soft names for feelings that had learned to stop pretending to be people. The envelope bore the same elegant script, to the child who would remember what never happened. But inside, new words had appeared like morning light, finding its way through patient curtains. Thank you for teaching hearts the difference between what feeds them and what merely fills the empty spaces. The crescent on Saul's wrist pulsed with deep, resonant peace, not the gentle warning of borrowed light, but the quiet satisfaction of work that had found its proper rhythm. Saul understood now that the letter hadn't been prediction but invitation. A whisper from whatever patient forces helped souls discover their purpose through the long, beautiful work of becoming more themselves. Walking through bellwether at dawn, Saul carried final understanding like a small lamp in their chest. At the bakery, Thomas kneaded dough with hands that remembered being guided by smaller ones. His grief transformed from wound into bridge connecting what was lost to what remained. Raffi waved from behind flower-dusted glass, his smile carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to distinguish between pictures that changed themselves and memories that grew in soil enriched by honest. Her attention. The library breathed softly in morning light, books having arranged themselves into new conversations between covers. Thora looked up from her work with eyes like folded linen, nodding at the recognition that passes between people who have witnessed important work finding its completion. "The stories continue," she murmured. "They always do. You just learn to read between the lines." At the lighthouse, Jun stood watching waves roll in with their ancient, unhurried rhythm. "Breath is still a leash you can loosen," they said, voice carrying the texture of patient stone meeting endless water. "And time still stretches when you ask it kindly." Sul demonstrated the technique once more, breathing space into the moment until it held room for profound gratitude to settle like truth, finally finding its home. Letters arrived regularly from apprentices, scattered like lanterns across distant towns. Elara wrote of setting tea for unfinished voyage and sleeping better once feelings had names instead of borrowed faces. Marcus sent photographs with fewer artificial smiles and richer shadows, having learned to let missing be itself, rather than masquerading as impossible presence. Each note felt like breadcrumbs shining faintly on paths behind Sul, proof that the work had learned to walk without being carried. Back home, Eleanor moved through evening rituals with grandmother wisdom, making simpler sandwiches for David's wandering appetite, while humming lullabies that carried the texture of inherited melodies, the ones that tasted like earth after rain, settling in the chest like stones you could build foundations on. Miri helped arrange the good plates, her small hands careful with treasures that had learned to hold both authentic memories and grateful acknowledgement of what had merely visited. The story didn't conclude. It exhaled softly into starlight, where authentic love and gentle longings danced together in infinite dark. Soul's role expanded like circles, spreading from stones dropped in patient water, the crescent continuing to pulse with recognition, helping hearts distinguish between memories that grew from soil and those that grew from yearning, blessing both while teaching what deserved daily tending. Somewhere in the distance, new apprentices gathered around kitchen tables, learning to taste the difference between cotton candy sweetness and bread that nourished. The notebook would find its way to other hands, other hearts learning the delicate art of welcoming beautiful fabrications without mistaking them for lasting nourishment. Kettles whistled hello in honest voices, while families discovered the patient work of tending connections that required daily attention but fed something deeper when nourished with authentic care. And with that, Soul stretches into the stars, still helping hearts distinguish between what feeds them and what merely comforts them, still blessing the beautiful parasites that remind us how deeply we long to belong. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.